Hi, I'm Oliver Koukoulis-Fribbens, the Chief Sales Officer at Phonexa, and today I'm joined again with our friend and partner, Chaz at CallTools.
Pleasure to be here, Oliver. Thanks for having me back.
So obviously last time we sort of connected, Chaz, we spoke a lot about the lead to sale journey and what that looks like from a dialing perspective and what that looks like from a lead management perspective. And the sort of purpose of today's call is mainly just to follow on from that initial conversation and talk about maybe the other end of that. So I know that both of our companies work with a lot of businesses that are managing warm transfers and selling warm transfers, either receiving them as a buyer and receiving them transfers from a lead gen, or vice versa. They are the lead gen and they're actually doing the dialing and they're connecting with consumers and they're then selling those calls to third parties. So what I wanted to talk about today really was around the best practices, some of the technologies that can be utilized in that journey, and how the listeners of this can actually optimize and build more revenue out of that. From your perspective, I know that you guys have a lot of experience, obviously, on both sides of that, either people that are doing the dialing and doing the warm transfers or people that are receiving the inbound call. I know that you were going to give us some overviews on some of the best practices from either side, but we talked a lot about the dialing cadence and things like that last time. So I suppose this time it's really going to be about the buyer receiving the call and what they can do to optimize that. What are your thoughts on that particular piece?
Thank you so much. So I think we did cover a lot in terms of working leads as they come through, taking them through the journey, the follow-up cadence, all the things that go into that on our previous session. I think right now what I'd love to touch on is really if you're buying leads, what are some of the things we see that are working extremely well for those folks? Also for the ones that are selling leads, right? And that's where I want to lean on you, Oliver, as the expert, what they're doing to maximize who they're sending the lead to and when. And I think there's a lot of cool things within the Phonexa system and just ideologies overall that can help lead sellers be much more successful and capture as much of that revenue as they can in terms of selling those calls. In terms of receiving calls, something I've seen that's very important from the lens of CallTools and people that are buying leads and buying transfers and buying just inbound calls is the ability to, one, ping a queue for availability. So this is a benefit on both the buyer and the seller end, because the seller will be able to see, okay, does this buyer have anyone available to take this call at this time? And on the receiving end, right, they don't want to get pushed calls that maybe are billable that they're not even able to connect with. That's been super important. I know within your system and within, most ping post systems or call tracking systems, you can do that availability ping. That's correct?
Yeah, it's a very important point actually to touch on, because there's a lot of industries that aren't already utilizing this technology. And the thing is that depending on how they're running their agency or their call center, I've heard loads of horror stories about people buying calls that they don't answer and things like that. And this particular feature that you're talking about here, with the ability of being able to receive an API request in advance of accepting the call to ensure that it's a call that we want. It's in our demographic, it's in our territory, it's the time of day that we have agents in. We've actually got somebody that's not on the phone currently that could, in theory, pick that call up before actually saying, hey, yes, we want that call. It's a game changer, really, because it just means that, hey, the efficiency there is vastly greater, and they're ensuring that, hey, they're not getting this situation where calls are coming through, nobody's answering them, they're getting a bill from the call generator saying, hey, you owe us for all these calls because, hey, we sent them to you and you just didn't pick them up. That's not on us, that's on you. It mitigates that whole scenario. And
on the seller's end too, they're trying to sell that call. A lot of the times maybe there's a buffer built in where the call has to be a certain duration or has to connect with an agent. Why do they want to work really hard, build the interest, get to the point where they're going to make that transfer just to hit a dead end, and now that person can't get it? So it's creating bad experience if you don't have some of these mechanisms in place.
Yeah, for sure. And I think as well, one point that we're potentially missing there too is the consumer experience, because hey, who likes being on hold, right? I despise it personally. If they're saying, hey, let me pop you on hold while I transfer you and while I connect you with an agent, they're trying to get through and they're waiting for somebody to answer, and then that buyer doesn't answer, so they then have to redial somebody else and go through that process again. It makes that whole time longer and longer and longer for that consumer, and that's when you get sort of consumer drop rates and all that, so you get dropped calls and lost revenue in that way as well.
Yeah, and it's something that comes up too, where if we, let's say, for example, onboard a new CallTools client and they say, yeah, we're going to be buying transfers, they might not even be aware unaware sometimes about how, this pre-ping works or the availability ping works. Like, oh, is your vendor going to ping you ahead of time? What? How does that work? I don't know. I kind of give it to them, like, hey, ask them if they can do it. They'll be like, we'll just start this way. We'll get to that later on, usually within a couple days or a week. Yeah, we want to set that ping up. We're not handling these calls the way we wanted to. I think it's a really important piece. And I think, it creates efficiency for everybody, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, that particular ping that we're talking about there as well. It doesn't necessarily just have to be used for agent availability either. We see this pre-ping or in advance of a call being connected used for a variety of things. So one, yes, checking that there's an agent available, but also if the lead generator that is, they've got the consumer on the call, they've taken the information about the consumer, they then want to find the most appropriate buyer for this. So not just one that's available, but actually who's the best fit buyer to service this customer. If we're talking about something like home services, or we're talking about insurance, or we're talking about something that is potentially geographically bound either by distance of travel, being able to get to the consumer, or by licensed states, or whatever it might be that's preventing a particular buyer from accepting particular consumers, it means that by doing that pre-ping ahead of the call, they can say, hey, I've got this consumer, this is the phone number for the consumer, this is the zip code that they're in, this is the particular service that they require. They can send all of this data in advance of the call being connected. And based on that, the buyer can then actually decide, okay, well, can we service this customer? Do we have an agent available to actually accept that call? If they sent that call to us right now, would we be able to pick it up? Have we hit our capacity for the day? If we're on a budget or a daily budget of how many calls we want to buy or how much revenue we want to, all of this kind of stuff. Do we want to buy it because we've hit our revenue cap or whatever it might be for the day? So all of these things can be taken into account before they go, hey, yeah, send us the call. And all of those things combined actually just ensure that when they are sending the call to the right buyer, that actually they're sending it to a buyer that can service it, that's going to pay for it, that's going to actually deliver a good experience for the consumer. And it just makes that entirety of that process a lot simpler. And that's where something like Phonexa can come into that, in the fact that, rather than going back to the journey that we were talking about where the agent's on the phone and they're trying to find the right buyer and they've got a list of 5 different buyers they can send it to. They've got to manually try and panic. I've got someone on the phone that wants to speak to somebody. Who am I going to call? Who am I going to put them through to? And manually having to make that decisioning themselves is actually, they can just send that call into the system. The system makes the decisioning based on API. It checks with all the buyers that they work with simultaneously via API to say, hey, who wants it? Who can service it? Who's available to take it? And then we'll route that call automatically to that relevant buyer. So from everybody's perspective, from the agent to the business that agent works for, to the consumer, to the business buying the call, everyone in that journey is suddenly a lot more efficient and is a lot happier with that process.
For sure. And I think what's really cool, well, there's different universes we're discussing here, but if you're not using a system like this today and you're selling transfers or sending calls, to use a platform like Phonexa is a huge monumental leap forward in controlling all these things that we're talking about, the availability ping, who to send the call to, who's the highest bidder. Maybe you have 3 people that are eligible to receive that call, but one is willing to spend $100 for that call and the other one's only spending $50. To maximize your profit as a business, you're going to maybe want to go to the highest bidder. We could get deeper into the analytics behind here. And Oliver, you probably look at this much more frequently than I do, but you might be surprised. Sometimes you think the highest bidder is where you want to go, but sometimes you analyze the data, maybe they can't convert as well, and there's some other things going on where maybe it's the middle bidder, right? Maybe it's not the highest, maybe it's not the lowest. The guy that's right in the middle at $75 is actually converting much better. They're taking more volume. There's a lot of factors there. Do you see that, Oliver, as you begin to work with clients and see how they're kind of setting up their distribution strategies to their buyers? That's one thing I always thought. It's almost like maybe in certain circumstances, yes, highest bidder, that's probably an important variable, something you want to hit. But do you ever see where maybe the highest bidder isn't the best?
It's interesting you say that. And that depends on the commercial agreements that have been made with the buyer that's receiving the call. Sure. Because obviously, yes, on the face of it, you would think, okay, someone's paying me $100, someone's paying me $75, someone's paying me $50. On the face of it, $100 wins, right? But the thing is, there's other things at play here. You're quite right about that. One of the biggest ones is duration to sell, or that buffer that is placed. So a lot of call buyers, if not all call buyers, will actually say, right, well, yes, we'll accept the call, and only once it reaches a certain duration does it become billable. scalable. And obviously that varies business to business. Some might be 30 seconds, some might be a minute, some might be 2 minutes, etc.
Right.
And you've then got that playing into that equation. So that $100 buyer, if they've got a 2-minute duration to sell, ultimately of the calls that we send them, a lower percentage of them will reach that duration to sell. Whereas the $75 buyer, they may have a lower duration to sell, which ultimately means that the calls that we sell them overall on a cost per call or an overall earning per call, that actually they're earning us more because of that. Those kinds of decisionings then need to come into it. And this is all things that are not possible at a human level. If you've got an agent there trying to do this math of hey, who do I send it to? Yeah.
To transfer to and the phone number.
It's just, if you're working with a singular buyer, right? If you're just sending, I get somebody on the phone, I send them all to the same place, hey, then this potentially isn't relevant. But as soon as you start introducing more than one buyer that you could potentially sell that call to, then this kind of technology becomes very, very relevant. The bigger that panel of buyers that you then work with, the more relevant it becomes, because you're starting to introduce different commercial models and different durations to sell and different filters that they need to apply into the call of, which states they can accept and which all this kind of stuff starts to, and it just becomes too complex for the agent to actually manually have to determine where to send a call. So there's a lot of revenue left on the table if you are in a position where you are letting your agent determine who they're going to send it to, because they're not going to take into account all those factors. It's just not possible for them to.
And then you think about the everything's working as a well-oiled machine, just the tracking alone. Who got what call? How long was that call? How much are they spending on that call? Can I look at last week and see how many calls this buyer received from us, so that when we reconcile with them or share the report, we can actually have great tracking there. I mean, these are all things too that without a platform, to manage that, it's very hard to keep track of.
Exactly that. And we obviously see this across a lot of different industries. The biggest ones I would say at the moment are probably insurance, home services, some of the biggest ones that the buy calls on this model already. But I imagine that, there's a lot of industries that are maybe a little bit further behind and that are buying calls and are receiving calls, but they are not utilizing this type of technology to maximize that yet. But the key operative there is that it's yet.
Right.
As soon as someone in that industry that is maybe behind starts doing it, the rest will follow. Ideally, if you are in an industry where this hasn't been adopted yet, do you want to be an early adopter or do you want to be a late adopter?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the efficiencies it creates are crazy. Let's just recap for a minute. So we've kind of gone through, you have the ability to send a record to the system. You're able to see all the available buyers. Of those available buyers and filters and bids, you can then ping them to see if they're accepting that lead or if they have an agent available. Then you're going to get to the point where you decide, yes, I am sending this lead to this buyer. Let's send it. And something we didn't touch on that's another benefit, or it helps everyone in the chain, is that you're able to send that post of that record. So you're getting the first name, last name, address, whatever relevant information that you have at that time, sending it to the buyer. So long as the buyer has a system like CallTools, where they can receive that data and then they can receive the transfer behind it. Now, at the time when that call is received by the receiving party or by the buyer, they have all the information right there. So I know I'm talking to Oliver. I know he's living in Florida. He's got, XYZ criteria about him. And now it's a validation versus getting that handoff and then having to ask all the same information that person just got a minute ago. And they're, I just gave this to you. Why are you asking me this again? Just the ease of the conversation becomes much more rich because you are able to basically validate as opposed to asking.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really, really good point because, again, that's creating less friction with the consumer. And ultimately, the less friction that you've got with the consumer, the easier job the buying agent that's receiving the call is going to have in terms of converting that customer into business. And if you're buying hundreds of calls, thousands of calls, it all becomes a numbers game, doesn't it? And if you can increase that conversion percentage even a little bit, then actually the return on investment on the calls that you're buying is suddenly amplified massively, right? I imagine, that you guys have that kind of conversation with the clients that are receiving calls. And have you had any examples of clients that you work with that maybe have started buying calls without data initially and then have transitioned to buying calls with data, and how that's then ultimately changed the performance of the campaign? Or have you had any sort of use cases or examples of that?
I had one very recently. We just put on a personal injury call center. Yep. They buy, from 5-6 different vendors. I'm sure the vendors all have their own methodology of sending the data, how they deliver it. They come into queues use, on the CallTools system, but only one of their vendors is sending the contact information. It's ironic you're asking this question. I just had this conversation 2 days ago. He's like, yeah, this lead source historically for us hasn't always been the best, whatever, but we turned on that data post and now everyone on the floor is saying, oh yeah, the ones that come with the data, those are the best transfers. Those are the best, So psychologically, I don't know if much changed other than they weren't sending the data and then that they were. It could also be agent perception, right? Oh, I've got information. This is a much better opportunity for me than a blank record, right? But yeah, I just had that conversation with a real client about 2 days ago. That was the feedback that they were giving. Yeah, they're loving these. Now that the data is there, it's incredible. To answer your question, I think it's a no-brainer. If you can have information versus not have it, you always want to have it.
Yeah, of course, the call track for the agent's going to be easier, isn't it? It might be a psychological thing, absolutely, and I think it's prudent not to touch on that. But whether it's psychological or not, the fact that actually the response from the sales team is improved, and the fact that they're more confident with those leads, and ultimately all of that's going to boil down to more conversions. So whether it is actually an improvement in the journey for the consumer and how the call's being handled, or whether it's just a mindset change for the agent, either way the outcome's the same, and that actually the improvement of the campaign is there. So that's what we're looking for, right?
And then one other thing I've seen work really well is that when these calls are coming in, there's systems out there. They've already done the availability ping. They've already seen which agents are there. But with the CallTools system, we have an auto answer. So as long as that agent's available and they're in the queue, we don't ring them and say, oh, do you want to pick this call up, or do you want to reject this call, or are you going to let it time out and let it go to somebody else? It's just going to see that you're available, and it's going to answer that call and connect you to it right away. So there's many times where a client is receiving a transfer, it won't even ring. Like, it almost seems like it connects too fast because it just sees that they're there already. You won't hear a ring. You won't hear hold music. Hi, how you doing? My name's Chaz. I'm with XYZ Insurance. How can I help you? And it just connects that fast. Again, creating efficiency where you're not taking that extra 10, 15 seconds to let it ring and have somebody pick it up. It's coming in extremely quickly. For the seller, they're getting a much better, quicker response. They're not having their agents waiting and potentially having people drop. And from the buyer side, they're just connecting and not giving their agents the ability to, which again, you would think, right, if you're in the role where your job is to handle these inbound transfers, you'd be excited and willing to answer that call. But again, any place where you leave human intervention and let a individual make a decision when they want to pick up, how quickly they want to pick up, you're creating inefficiencies in your process.
That's key as well, because there's obviously a lot of things to touch on in just that particular piece that you're talking there. Yes, the phone is being answered quicker, but what that does mean is not just is the phone being answered quicker and is it creating an efficiency around how quickly the consumer's being spoken to, but if you're compounding that over hundreds, thousands of agents, and you're compounding that over days and weeks, months, then actually the volume of calls that can then be handled, it might only be a few seconds, right? It might be that, hey, the call's answered 5 seconds quicker than it would have been otherwise. But if you're it's the law of big numbers, right? If you're doing that day in, day out, week in, week out over hundreds of thousands of agents, suddenly you're able to take over the course of a year hundreds of thousands of more calls that result in hundreds of thousands of more dollars earned, right? It's just, it's law of big numbers is all it is. It's interesting to talk about that as well.
This is amazing. I think we're touching on a lot of key things. I hope everyone watching is gaining some valuable insight into not only the technologies, but like just workflow, right? Like, what are the options that I have to me that I can use to expand what I'm doing? Another thing I think is important too is the feedback loop, right? This call comes through, it gets connected, and then there's going to be some level of disposition, right? Was this a sale? Was this a not interested? Was this a bad opportunity to follow up? So then being able to have a callback that goes back to the Phonexa system or back to your call tracking provider, right? To say, okay, here was the disposition of this call and here's what happened, right? And that's where I think you touched on it for a minute there, Oliver. The conversion metrics and what's actually happening gets that full picture. If you're not getting that final disposition fed back and you're not analyzing the full thing as a whole, you might just see, oh yeah, I'm sending calls over here and it looks great and we're billing for them. But let's go back to the 100, 75, and 50. Customer A is dispositioning all the calls as no sale, not interested. Customer B in the sweet spot in the middle is getting sale. So you're seeing, okay, okay, all else equal, it's the same quality of lead, same quality of transfer, all else equal. It's just the two different providers we're sending them to. Maybe provider A at $100 just doesn't have the right script or the right team, and they just can't convert for whatever the reason is. So knowing that, you now have things that you can do, right? You can reach out, hey, we see these aren't converting for you. What's going on? You know, maybe you need to meet with your team. Like, it opens up that conversation. Whereas if you don't have that data, you might prioritize working with that top vendor. I'm just going through all these hypotheticals, right? Hey, you guys don't have enough volume for me. Let's cut. I'm done with this. You guys aren't sending it to me because you're prioritizing that first one. When in reality, the first one isn't converting at all. And after a while, they say, you know what, guys, this campaign's not working for us. Let's shut it down. So now you've lost number one because they can't convert. You've lost number two because they, were upset about the volume and they've gone elsewhere. So now you're still left with number three, the lowest bidder.
Yeah, it's important though, because as the call vendor selling the transfers, right? Yes, you're being paid on a duration to sell, right? But actually, it's not that keeps the campaign live, right? It's the cost per acquisition for the client that keeps the campaign live. And all the time that cost per acquisition stays within a range that the buyer is comfortable with, they're going to keep buying calls, and they're going to buy more and more calls because it's working for them. And if you're getting that feedback loop and you're able to determine, in those initial buyer discussions that you have with them, right, okay, well, what's the target cost per acquisition for you? Where do you need calls to be for them to actually be valuable to you and for you to be able to keep this campaign on and buy more calls? If you're having those discussions early on and you're tracking those metrics your side, then again, you guys can ensure the call vendor can ensure that they're staying within those boundaries, and they can determine, hey, if we're going either way of that, if we're going too high and we're outside of their cost per acquisition, we need to work out a fix here, because sooner or later that campaign's going to go off. Or if we're short selling ourselves and we're producing a phenomenal cost per acquisition for them, is there anything else that we can do here to improve our earnings to make sure that we're getting a good deal out of this relationship as well?
Yeah, and data is everything. Having that, I think, is critical. Full picture, how many calls you sent, what the dispositions were, all the different bidders and the reporting. It's just so important, especially if this is the line of business you're in, which is selling calls, transfers. And believe it or not, I still see a lot of people out there that are operating, like you said, just like one buyer, direct transfer, no ping. I'll look at their Q stats. They missed 30% of their calls a day, right? Because they just didn't have anybody available. There's a lot that you can be doing here to create the efficiency, maximize revenue, and on the buyer, the receiving end, to ensure the highest level of success and to only be taking in the opportunities that you can work.
This is another thing to sort of talk about as well. And I don't know if we save this for maybe yet another follow-on session. But,
keep it going. This is good.
I'll cover it briefly here as well, just so that we can sort of touch on this. You're talking about obviously lost calls and drop calls and things. Something that we've been seeing quite recently that's interesting, and this is kind of another synergy between the two platforms here is, let's say as a call vendor, I've generated a call and, I've spent marketing budget on it. Maybe my agent spent time nurturing that lead and getting it to a point where, hey, it's ready to warm transfer. And I do have a panel of buyers, and I do have agent availability pings. So I do have all of this technology in place to ensure that I get the call to the right place. And hey, I send out that ping, no one's available. So that's another scenario that can crop up. And something that's quite interesting that we've seen here on that scenario is actually what happens there. And because obviously with systems like CallTools, we can send an API ping of data in. Actually, what we can do is we can set it as a callback, and we can push in a lead that can then be called back later. So the value of the call has obviously dropped, because obviously we all know that a lot of buyers will pay more for a call than they will for a data lead. But if it's a choice between no sale because I've got no buyer, or sell it as a data lead, hey, at least then there is a fallback option there to ping that to somebody as a data lead. Do
you guys support that today? You have that option?
Yeah, we can support that today. Yeah. Cool. So there's options to do things like that as well. And it just means that ultimately it's still getting somewhere. And we've also seen this from a buyer perspective where they are running their own paid media. So, I'm running Google ads, I'm running Facebook ads, I'm running all of this kind of stuff. I've got a contact center. Somebody dials in, but the contact center is not online yet. Typically that would go to voicemail, right? That would just go to voicemail. Someone would pick it up in the morning when they get into the office. We're also now seeing, with the rise of AI that we're seeing everywhere at the moment, actually sending that to an AI agent that picks up the call and that is taking data from the consumer. Yeah, gathers all the data. Again, the AI agent isn't there to close the deal. That's, we might get there at some point, but right now, hey, no. But for the minute, what we can do is we can actually capture all of the consumer data, even down to, hey, when's the best time to call you?
That's very
When's the best time to call you back?
And that's in this industry, what I've seen is the AI agent has really made a place for itself on inbound calls, right? So where you're connecting to it on an inbound level and being able to have that conversation. Again, can it sell? Maybe. In some cases, I don't know if that's the best application to try and force it to do that at this point in time. But just to carry the conversation, hey, thank you for connecting. I heard you had an amazing call with Oliver. Can I just validate some information here? Great. This is awesome. And what works best for you? Tomorrow at 3 o'clock or tomorrow at 5 o'clock for a call back? Okay, great. Yes, we'll call you back tomorrow at 3 or 5. Thank you so much. And now you've had a nice transaction, a nice clean conversation. And again, it's recovered something that would have been lost. And plus you think about the consumer too, right? In that situation, oh, let me transfer you to the next available agent. Hold on. Oh, actually there's no agents available. So that 20 minutes you just spent with me, maybe somebody might call you back at some point in time. See you later. Bye. That's not a great experience.
We've obviously covered a lot in this particular session, and I don't want to keep going over points that we've already covered. I think we've covered a lot in one session. Maybe we do another session at some point. Hey, if there's any topics that maybe we've touched on a little bit here and that actually anyone that has viewed this has thought, actually, I would like to know more about that and we can offer some insight on it, then great, let's go. And I'd be more than happy to jump on with you again, Chaz, and run through specific points that anyone has raised. And obviously, again, it's a pleasure speaking with you. We love working with you guys, and hopefully we can put out some more valuable, hopefully this is valuable, but some valuable content like this in the future as well.
Awesome. Well, for anyone out there who is checking this out, who attended this session here today, if you haven't checked out Phonexa, you definitely have to check them out. They've got a big suite of a lot. I don't even think I know all the different things you guys do, but some incredible technology and platforms. CallTools, we have a cloud contact center solution, phone system for inbound and outbound phone calls, power dialer, all kinds of functionality there as well. Oliver, if somebody wanted to reach out to you and learn more, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, the best way to get in touch with me is either drop me an email. You can reach me on oliver@phonexa.com, or you're welcome to give me a call on my cell as well, which is 747-311-2182. So either of those, you can reach me directly.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'm Chaz Tedesco, Chief Operating Officer at CallTools. You can email me at Chaz, C-H-A-Z as in zebra, at calltools.com. I don't want to be Chad with a D, so there's a Z in there. And it's 973-370-5711. We look forward to hearing from you guys. And please feel free to share anything that you learned in this session with either of us, anything you want to learn more about. And Oliver, again, it's been a pleasure being here with you today.
100%. Great to see you again.
Take care.